Good evening to everybody and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for the second of the 2021 winemaking webinars. This is going to be on preparation for still wine bottling. And I have to inform you that we are recording this webinar, and the recording will be available in the members area of the WineGB website. So the recording is only available to members. And I just have to point out that this is just for information. We are giving our time freely and willingly to help where we can, but any action taken based on any advice that you receive this evening or interpret from this evening is down to you, and we take no responsibility for any subsequent things that may happen. Or something along those lines. I can't remember exactly what the disclaimer was supposed to say, but I think you probably get the picture. I'm going to introduce the three panelists this evening. So I'm just sitting here fielding questions or chat and things like that, whereas, because I am not a still wine bottling specialist by any stretch of the imagination, but if I want still wine bottling, I ask David Cowderoy to do it for me. So David Cowderoy is one of your panelists this evening, along with Josh Donahue-Spire from Chapel Down, who produces an awful lot of very good quality still wine every year, and Sam Lindo from Camel Valley down in Cornwall, who also has a stellar reputation for producing fantastic still and sparkling wines, as does Josh. So can I just ask that questions, you use the Q&A for questions, because Sam will be monitoring those questions. Feel free to use the chat to talk amongst yourselves, say hi, or to make comments, but the Q&A section is for the questions, please. Anything in the chat might get missed, but yeah, please do use the chat if you wish to chat amongst yourselves if we're boring you. Anyway, I will hand over to Sam, I guess, and then you can get the guys going. So yes, enjoy.
Yeah, so really the aim of this is so that you can get your still wines in exactly the same conditions when you made your blending decisions, in front of the customer. So we're not really going to think about natural wines. For us, it's about sterile bottling and doing everything that we need to do to make sure the wines are stable and they are exactly what we want them to be when they're in the final bottling. So we'll start off with preparing the wine for bottling, and hopefully at the end we'll have a little bit about the day of bottling. So I guess the first thing, we've made our decision, and for us, before we actually start mixing the wines together, we look at the protein stability of the wines. So Josh, do you want to talk about how you test for protein stability and what your views are?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I mean, I think before we start, I think it's worth saying why we're doing these tests. Why do we look at the wine in such close focus before we put it in bottle? And the simple answer is that it's much cheaper and easier to rectify a problem when it's not in a bottle. So if you've got a protein instability, for example, much easier to sort it out in a tank than in a bottle. So why look at it? Yeah, I mean, it's potential to cause haze in the bottle, and that has, there's low acceptability for that with most consumers, and certainly, multiple retailers. That would not be acceptable, and that would lead to product recall. So there's a lot of cost involved there in terms of money and also reputational damage. So it's definitely one to get right. The kind of standard for checking it is a heat test. So, before you put your wine in a bottle, put it through a heat test. Now, protein stability is not a binary, stable, unstable thing. It is, a wine will be stable for a certain temperature for a certain length of time. And so you need to think about how stable you need your wine to be and what you're doing to it. So, different people have different tests. Some are, 70 degrees for 15 minutes. This is in a water bath or in an oven as well. Some people use a lab oven. And then what you do is you take your wine. It should be clear. It's ready to bottle at this point. You take a sample, measure the NTU. It's the normal way of doing it. And then put it in the oven for however long. So, some people it's 70 degrees, 15 minutes. We take a bit more of a harsher view, and we do a longer test at a higher temperature. And then we take the sample out, allow it to cool. That's really key. And allow it to cool for a consistent amount of time between samples. And then measure the NTU again, subtract one from the other, and then you get your delta NTU. And then again, your interpretation of what a pass is depends on where your wine's going. If you're making wine in Australia and you're sending it to the UK, there's a good chance it's going to sit somewhere very hot in a container on the equator, and it's going to get really hot for a long period of time. So you're probably going to be a bit more risk averse than somebody who's making a few thousand bottles, selling it direct from their farm gate for local consumption. So think about the wine and think about how you want to do it. And I'll just touch briefly, I don't want to go too much into it, but if you're using CMC, then it's very important that your wine is absolutely protein stable. So that's another reason why you might be doing it.
And do you check protein stability before blending, or do you only do it after blending?
So make your blend, then you check protein stability at different levels of bentonite to establish what your bentonite rate is. You then add your bentonite with any other findings that you might add. Obviously, you've done lab trials on that as well. And then you would check it afterwards as well, just to make sure that it's done what you think it was going to do.
Because we always actually protein stabilize the component parts before we blend, because you can make, when proteins get tangled, they can get more difficult to drop out. So we'll do, and that normally does it, but may have to make a further protein stabilization later. But I just wanted to ask David about the other issue with proteins and filtering.
Yeah, well, you can get lots of problems with proteins and filtering. But just before we get on to that, I just wanted to add to a few things Josh was saying. First off, when you do your protein stability trials, you must use the same bentonite that you're going to use in the finished product. Quite often people send samples off to labs, say, can you give them the protein stability? And you've absolutely no idea what activity of bentonite that is being used. But also to keep in mind, the reason for doing a protein stability test and what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to simulate conditions which will cause proteins to drop out in bottle. So if you're in Australia, it's blistering hot in the back of a car where people go, wine goes in the back of a car, probably could even get up to 80 degrees, which is a test generally used in Australia. Then it goes in the fridge. In the UK, is that the case? Not really. So if people have the ability to do their own testing, I normally recommend not just doing one temperature, but actually profiling it. If you're doing it at 70 degrees C, see what the difference is after half an hour and then after 2 hours. And it'll give you an idea where your sort of risk lies. And generally you'll see that different protein levels different bentonite levels, it'll get to an addition where it works at all tests and you go, right, okay, that's the one we need to use. But in terms of filtration, as Sam was just alluding to, one of our requirements for when we bottle still wines is that we receive samples the week before bottling so that we can do a filtrability test. Filtration at bottling is not designed to remove anything. It's designed there as a safeguard against microbes getting into the finished product. So the wine has to be able to pass through sterile filters without a problem. And what we found is that if the samples are sent too far in advance, the filtrability index will be great. But then the day of bottling, the membrane blocks up. And well, actually, Sam, you've got the better science behind this than I have, haven't you?
Yeah, so basically the proteins are a certain shape, and when they, over time, or also with temperature change, they can kind of unfurl into a bigger structure. So you may have sent it through a 0.2 membrane crossflow, and the proteins have just slipped in like a worm through a hole. But then when it comes to bottling and you're using a membrane and it's like a sieve, the proteins can unfurl and just block up the holes. And you can get a sort of a catastrophic situation where they just block up the filter very quickly as they just hit the face of the filter. So you can do all the protein testing you like, but then they can just catch you out. So I think the temperature of the wine and the time really has an effect. But you've got a sort of extra thing to help you through that with your filtration setup on the bottling line.
Yeah, I mean, our filtration regime has until recently been a 1 micron filter before a 0.45 membrane, which is like sort of industry standard. And what we're finding is that the 1 micron would never really block up, only when someone had made a big mistake with filtration or something like that. And it's always the membrane that blocks up. We then discussed this with our filtration supplier, and they recommended putting another cartridge in the middle. We now have a 0.4 nominal filter. So it's not a membrane. It's actually has some depth characteristics to it. So it will remove some of those protein problems. And since we've done that, we've had no problems at all.
So you don't get the catastrophic buildup of proteins blocking up because there is depth in there. So it can take a lot, it doesn't block up.
Exactly. Plus the fact that they are polypropylene, which are quite robust, so you can clean them with caustic, which will then denature the proteins and regenerate the filtration capacity.
Yeah, it's just amazing. You can block up a membrane filter and then just put the hot caustic through, and it's just back to normal, having not been able to pump wine at any speed. So,
but not just proteins, also colloids too will affect that, do the same thing.
Yeah, so the other big sort of macro thing we have to deal with is tartrate stability. Josh, you want to talk about testing and your approach to this with the still wines?
Yeah, I mean, again, why test for it? It's much better to sort it out before it becomes a problem in bottle, because then it's an expensive problem. Crystals forming in the bottle is again unacceptable by consumers, so again would lead to product recall. You need to make sure the wine is stable before it goes into bottle. Whatever your cold stabilization method, whether it's traditional cold stab, CMC, whatever, metatartaric, KPA, ion exchange, whatever you're doing, you need to check it. And there are a couple of, broadly speaking, a couple of ways of doing it. There's a hold cold test. So, taking a clear sample, putting it in a freezer or cold water bath for a set period of time, and then looking for crystals. That's one way of doing it. Or the other way is using conductivity. So, yeah, again, it's a much quicker. The problem with the hold cold test is it usually takes quite a long time, and if you want a quick answer, then the conductivity test works better, but it's not perfect. And that involves putting a sample into a cold bath, agitating it, measuring the conductivity. You then drop potassium hydrogen tartrate in, and the amount that dissolves will affect the conductivity of the wine and therefore show you how much could be dissolved. And that kind of is linked to its ability to precipitate crystals. We've got an automatic kind of setup for that called a check stab, which gives you graphs, and you kind of can show you a predictive model of the wine as to how stable it will be over time. And it's quite useful. You can use it before this step. I know we're talking about just the final checks before you go into bottle, but you can use it a long time before this step to see if certain treatments will work and how they will work on your wine and how they could interact with other things. For example, I know there are questions around CMC, but if you're putting CMC in and you're also interested in putting tannin in, well, it's interesting to do that in the lab first and see how they might interact, because it's likely there will be an interaction. So yeah, we tend to use the check stab. We do always send it off, but I tend to rely on the check stab quite a lot. It works well. What else do you want to talk about?
Well,
David?
Yeah, just to add about the analysis, it's important to bear in mind that these are ways of estimating the tartrate instability. They're not absolute. Also, very, very important to test the sample in its final state. So that's after any additions have been made to it. The sample needs to go through a membrane filter to simulate what will happen at bottling. because that will affect the stability. I also sort of, again, it's back to profiling the wine and seeing what the risk is. I like looking at different directions. So conductivity is a really good one. But one that I always do, which is very easy, is the freeze-thaw test. So you just freeze a sample, throw it out in the fridge, and see, are there any tartrates at the bottom? It's quite a severe test, because what happens is that as the wine is freezing, all the solutes concentrate, so you're actually increasing the concentration, and then the ice crystals act as nucleation points. But if it passes the freeze-thaw test, then it's a pretty good tick that you're resistant.
And it's Patricia's asked about Patricia Stamanovitz has asked about do any smaller people not worry about tartrates, and is it actually a problem to have tartrates in the wine? Our experience has been it's not really a problem to have tartrates in the wine unless people think it's glass, but but we do stabilize, but we're not overly concerned. It's not like protein where it really will. Emma.
PDO test requires the wines to be cold stable if you want to pass the PDO. Oh, and I was also going to add that physical cold stabilization with cream of tartar actually reduces the acidity, which can be quite handy if you need that as well.
That's another reason why I did the freeze-thaw test. It's quite an easy way of seeing what will drop out on cold stabilization, and do I actually want to cold stabilize it, or do I want to use CMC instead? We've done batches of wine where you do the freeze-thaw test and go, oh, that's a bit flat and flabby afterwards. Let's just use CMC.
Yeah, I think CMC increases it by 0.1 grams per litre, the acidity, or 0.01. It's a tiny increase, but
and the SO2.
Yeah. So
the only other thing to add, sorry, just one more thing. In the same way that and David alluded to this, in the same way that protein stability is not a binary yes/no, tartrate stability is exactly the same. So stabilize your wine at -4, seed it with 4 grams, filter it well, and passes all the right tests. Well, but if that wine is going to sit at a low temperature for a very long time, it still is at risk. So think about the way that you're storing. If you haven't got, if you've got uninsulated sheds that you're storing the wine in after bottling, then think about that, and that would inform your decisions.
We should also
the test.
We should also possibly touch on calcium tartrate instability too.
Okay, yeah.
So just before we leave CMC, we should just remind everyone that the rules are changing, and you can only use it for white wines now, not rosé or anymore. And the other thing about CMC is you can use it, but you really need to understand where it can go wrong, and it's not just an add and go thing. It needs to be suitable for each wine that you're making, and you need to understand about that. So,
and test for CMC, test, and test again. So I've had occasions where people have wanted to use CMC, and we've actually tested it, and I've got it tested, and it's come back, no, CMC won't work. And I've gone, oh yeah, I'll just put it in it, it'll be fine. And it wasn't. And that was a sparkling wine, so imagine how fun that was. Calcium tartrate instability, bit of a nasty subject, very, very difficult to treat, but it does crop up now and again. I would suggest that people get their wines analysed for calcium content. It's about the only way that you know that if you're going to have a problem. And actually on the subject of testing, getting a pre-bottling analysis is well worth the money. A lot of people just think, oh, okay, I'll save the money. It's not going to be worthwhile. And they're generally the people who have the problems. And obviously, if you do it yourself, that's great, but get a good, decent analysis. Can I ask you two, or three rather, if you've ever had any calcium tartrate instability problems? Any idea what it was tracked down to, Emma?
Well, I've had it in 2 wines that I've been aware of. One was one of ours, and one was a client. It's a nightmare because the wines just gush. And you can only see the crystals. I could only see the crystals under the microscope. And both wines, it was not apparent until after disgorging. So the wines disgorged fine, absolutely no problem, because you'd think if they were gutting, you wouldn't be able to disgorge them. So this is sparkling wine, so not still wines. So we can't spend too much time on it. And the calcium crystals precipitated after disgorging. So it was very tricky. You could just about manage to work with the wines, but it was it was a nightmare for both us and for the client in those two incidences. Bearing in mind we make hundreds of wines, it's only having two quite a bit of a relief. But who knows why it happens? I don't know.
We have had one actually. We had some Riesling that came in at 27 acid, and we deacidified it so much that
calcium carbonate.
It had that instability.
Yeah.
It can be treated though if you do have it. I haven't had it. I haven't seen it, but it can be treated.
But the treatment depends on the pH, so
yeah.
it's not a simple treatment. It's something that needs to be considered.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a time thing as well that you just have to wait often. So time sort all the problems that we're talking about today. If you wait longer till you bottle, does sort a lot of them out. So I think that's some of the macro things. So before we go to bottling, sort of final assessments. One thing that I think is important is sulfide assessment and H2S. Josh, do you want to?
Yeah, we'd always do an organoleptic screen on all the wines before they go to bottle. You normally would use copper. You can use copper and ascorbic, and you can also use cadmium to screen for different types of sulfides. It's not a difficult test to do. It's just a benchtop, 100 ml volumetrics or whatever, and just dose it and just see whether it improves it. And if you think you've got a problem, it's only going to get worse in bottle. So don't put it into bottle. Sort it out before you do go in. I know it's a really complicated subject, copper, and that can actually interact with the wine after bottling. But generally, if you've got an issue, then a small amount can help. So it's definitely worth doing. Yeah.
Do you copper sulfate or copper citrate?
We would use copper sulfate, but we don't. It's a rare thing that we use now. It's off topic for this webinar, but getting control of your fermentation, yeast strain, and nutrition has. We used to have a lot more problems than we do now because we've worked quite a lot on that, and so yeah. I still always do the screen because you never know. Sometimes you don't. You think it's fine, and then you do a trial and you think actually that is much cleaner. Obviously, using copper is not ideal. It takes away as well as it takes away the good stuff as well as the bad stuff. So it's quite a blunt instrument, but sometimes it can be helpful.
Yeah, we always found that using or relying on copper, the wines could still show that reduction later on in the bottle, and it's almost like the copper suspended it for a while. You lost the good stuff as well as then it coming back a little bit worse later on. So it is again something that you have to understand. And we feel a bit more aeration in the wines much earlier on, and picking that up at the end of ferment is the key to that. David, anything on H2S or?
No, nothing to add.
Excellent. And then CO2 levels in the wine. Do you adjust that before you send the wines off, Josh, or is that something that's done later?
Yes. So depending on the wine style. Again, think about the wine style. You want to have a target dissolved carbon dioxide level. You're going to have lots of CO2 in the wine, residual from fermentation. Even if it's been through racking or whatever filtration steps, it's still going to have dissolved CO2. And depending on your style of wine, that might be unacceptably high. No one really likes fizzy red. So particularly red, but even on whites, it depends what you want to do. There are some styles that actually, if your pH is a bit high or whatever, you might want to try and lift it with a bit of freshness and bottle at maybe 1400 milligrams dissolved carbon dioxide. But if your wine's tasting a bit green, your malic's a bit high anyway, you might want to come a bit lower. So I mean, on our wines, we'd normally be between 1,100 and 1,300 milligrams per litre dissolved carbon dioxide. And we test that using a carbodoser, which is a really cheap and easy thing to use. It's not hugely accurate. It's not as good as a dissolved carbon dioxide meter. They're a lot more expensive. But we would adjust it for that, mainly for the organoleptic reason. The secondary reason is that if you have a high dissolved carbon dioxide, then at bottling, because you'll be bottling at the correct temperature of about 20 degrees, it's going to start coming out and causing foaming in your filler, and that's going to cause separate issues really with fill heights and run speed and all kinds of stuff.
And how do you reduce the CO2 if it's too high?
So we would reduce dissolved carbon dioxide levels by sparging with nitrogen. So you're running a pump on the discharge side. You'd have a sinter, and you'd be sparging in nitrogen, which is insoluble, broadly speaking, in wine, and dissolved carbon dioxide would just be blown off basically. But you obviously need to be doing that at the right temperature. The other advantage of it is that it does reduce your DO, but it depends. What you want to be doing is sparging with nitrogen down to your target DO, and then sparging with CO2 back up to your target CO2. That's the ideal way. So our target DO at a bottle would be 0.5, and our target DCO2 would be about, as I said, 1,100 to 1,300. And if you want to hit 0.5, then you're probably going to, with nitrogen, then you're probably going to be lower than your CO2 target. So you have to sparge back up.
You touched on a very interesting point there, Josh, about sort of DO levels and sparging. But just to go back to what you're saying about red wines, I've seen a lot of red wines where the dissolved CO2 is just way too high, and it has a really negative impact on the sensory profile. The tannins taste harsher, the acidities taste higher, the fruit tastes less, and just simply degassing it makes a massive difference to the wine. It's something that just people don't think about enough. In terms of sparging with nitrogen, I personally think it's better to start working earlier, trying to reduce the CO2 levels, and rather than the thing you do just the night before bottling, going, oh heck, CO2 levels are too high, because then you end up having to sparge very, very heavily with nitrogen, and you blow off a lot of volatile aromas if you're not careful.
I was to say we when we warm the wine before bottling, we that brings us to the right CO2 levels normally. So we normally bottle around 20 degrees with the still wines, and you get to the right level of CO2 with that without having to blow anything off.
What's your right level then, Sam, out of interest?
What's our level?
Yeah.
Probably about 1,000, maybe 900.
Okay.
We found that once we're up to 1.4, it can cause problems with bottling, and it's slow, and we don't like standing in front of the line with that. So an easy life is always what dictates what we do. So below 1,000, we know it's going to be straightforward bottling. So residual sugar. Any thoughts on Josh, residual sugar for still wines?
I mean, residual sugar is something that you need to test for before you put it in bottle, because I mean, a couple of reasons, but the wine style, you should really know a long time before you're at bottling, because you'll have done an RS post ferment, you might have then done another one when you finished your blend, which will inform any sweetening decisions that you might take. Won't dictate them, but it might inform them. But then before bottling, always worth doing again, because you've made your addition. Have you hit the correct level? It's kind of just double checking that nothing's gone wrong, because again, it's that much more expensive to sort out when it's in a bottle. As a side note, so wine style is one thing. I guess on the other side, it would also affect some decisions that you might make around wine stability. So, for example, if you were choosing to work with a lower sulfur regime, or possibly, not choosing to sterile filter, or, I wouldn't advise any of this, but, and you had particularly low alcohol, if you then knew that you also had residual sugar, then it changes the risk matrix. There are all kind of risk factors there. And if you need to know what the RS is, because it will change your view on that.
Does it cause any problems for you, David?
It does, in terms of not so much residual sugar itself, but where residual sugar is adjusted. And the two ways of doing it are must concentrate and Sus Reserve. I mean, Sus Reserve is not very common nowadays, but I've come across it now and again, and a few people who make their own Sus Reserve. And the issue there is the Sus Reserve is added just before bottling and quite often can lead to tartrate instability problems. The rule to bear in mind is that a stable wine and a stable wine blended together do not equal a stable blend necessarily. And you add Sus Reserve and you can have all sorts of problems. And even with RCGM, there's various different grades around, and some of it's not filtered very well, and you can end up with filterability problems. So it's just forward thinking about, could this cause problems later on before you add anything to the wine?
Yeah, it's not a last minute addition, I think, for the wine. It's for us, we're trying to do it very early on in the blending process. So that is the wine, and then make sure nothing happens to it on the way. And then the other thing, Josh, is when you're sending wines off, do you adjust SO2 level in anticipation of what's going to happen when it's being filled, or is that adjusted when it gets there on your behalf?
Just for clarity, we and for those who don't know, we bottle a lot of our still wines at Greencroft Bottling Company, they're contract bottlers, but we also bottle the smaller volume wines down quite an old line at Tenterden at our vineyard there. So I guess there are two regimes. The first one would be if we're dispatching it for Greencroft, you want to get it in the right ballpark. You want to get it, you want to get it at the right level, really, for bottling, and then send it, and they can adjust it if necessary. But I wouldn't expect them to lose lots on the tankering process. One thing to say is that when you make the additions, if you make any additions of sulfur, make them with good time. So the sulfur will reach a new equilibrium. So don't test the wine in the morning of bottling, add your sulfur and expect it all to be there as free. Check it a good few days before, adjust it, then check it again, then adjust it again, because really it's the finessing to get it exactly right is important. So yes, we would get it plus or minus maybe 3 milligrams per litre free before we dispatch to Greencroft. And we do the same before we put it into our bottling room, and then we'd also check it on the day as well. It's not a difficult test to do. Aspiration, Ripper, FTIR, whatever your lab set up, or send it off. But then be aware that the samples that you're sending off, package them carefully. That's what I'd suggest. Put some inert gas in the bottle before you put the wine in. Minimize your headspace. Maybe use a sparkling bottle, fill it with CO2, then put your sample in, fill it. You can fill, because I say sparkling bottle because you can fill them quite full and put a cap on, and they'll withstand any pressure during transit. That will give you a better reading than if you fill a bottle that's without using any inert gas and send it off to a lab, and the number that they give you will be the amount that's left in the wine at that point. But that wine's gone through a very, very bad filling process, and if you wouldn't want to make any decisions based on that, really. The other things that you want to check, the other reasons you want to check it is to make sure that it's legal for sale. Because there are legal maximum limits, and you want to make sure that it's well under that, obviously, and how stable it's going to be. Think about how you want that wine to evolve over time.
David, SO2 can you add it on the day, or?
It's a question of getting there gradually. I mean, if you add it on the day, it's only going to be fine tweaking. You all know that if you add a certain quantity of SO2 to a wine, you don't get that as free. you'll only get some of it as free. So, but I found that, that the greater the addition, the greater the error. If you're just doing a fine tweaking of 5 milligrams per litre, then it's normally pretty accurate. And, bottling days are busy. You don't want to be messing around trying to add SO2 and analyze SO2. You want to get it all sorted out beforehand, night beforehand.
Someone has asked about pre-bottling analysis. Was that gone?
I typed an answer to it.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, we get pre-bottling analysis with an external lab. We only make 6 wines, 6 or 7 wines. So we always send it off to a laboratory for, pre-blending, post-blending for pre-bottling, and then also post-bottling. It just makes things a lot easier. So we do have a limited ability to check things, but we'll use the lab to benchmark what we're doing to make sure we're in the right ballpark for things. So, and then I think that brings us on to really the day of bottling, where it can all go very wrong. And like Josh said, I think reworking still wine means that you're going to have a worse wine at the end of it. It's not like sparkling where you've still got the same thing.
Just really touch briefly on SO2 levels.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because last Thursday they talked about SO2 in winemaking, but not so much on sort of the SO2 levels. Do you want to do this now or later?
Let's do it now. We're there.
Okay, Joe, can I share a few slides?
There are quite a few questions on levels of SO2 and molecular.
Well, if we go through this quickly. Okay, so you need to think about what you're adding SO2 for, why you're adding SO2 to a wine, what it does. So you need it for microbial stability. And as was touched on last week, that's very dependent on the pH. 0.6 is the minimum, 0.8 is the optimum. So you need to look at the charts that were presented last week and actually make sure that you're within that range. To remove dissolved oxygen, I put that in inverted commas because SO2 is not actually a very powerful antioxidant. It reacts with things that have been oxidized in the wine, and its speed of reaction isn't particularly great. So you need to also consider your dissolved oxygen pickup. And here it's not necessary just at bottling, it's throughout the winemaking process. I was interested to hear that Josh analyzes dissolved oxygen before he sends the wine off. Surprisingly, how few wineries actually have a DO meter, and the ranges can be massive. So where do you get DO from? Ullage space in tanks, very common. Any transfer, any operation, transfers twice, and bottling. The amount you can get at bottling will vary widely, depending on the bottling line that you have. This is a bit of a complicated slide. I'm not going to dwell on it for too long, but basically just I wanted to highlight this part here, which is inert gas purging of empty bottles. And that is filling the bottles with CO2 before they're filled can have a massive effect on dissolved oxygen pickup. So you're getting about 0.5 milligram per litre of difference by doing it or not doing it. You add all the different parts of protection against dissolved oxygen pickup at bottling, and you can have a variation of anything from 0.1 milligram per litre for a spectacular bottling line, average about sort of 1 for a modest, or half for a modest line. But I've seen some really old lines where you're talking about 5 milligrams per litre. So how does this impact on the SO2 levels? For each milligram of dissolved oxygen, you can consume 4 milligrams per litre of free SO2. So having an idea of how much dissolved oxygen you're going to pick up at bottling has a very significant impact on how much SO2 you add to the wine beforehand. If we go on to the last slide, we can see here some trials which are done in Australia, the Australian Wine Research Institute, where they were following the free SO2 levels following bottling. If you look at this section here, that is basically directly related to the DO pickup at bottling. So you get a fairly rapid drop in free SO2 level. Then second section is the dissolved oxygen pickup through the closure. So it's not just the DO levels in the wine at bottling, it's what DO it's going to pick up during maturation. So you're trying to do two things with SO2. You're trying to achieve microbial stability and you're trying to protect against oxidation. If you say you've got a wine with 30 milligrams per litre free SO2, I can't what I was going to say with this slide. It's gone from me. But basically, you need to think about the molecular SO2. So if you've got a low pH and you've got a modest SO2 level, then you're going to be protecting the wine during that early stage where it's still vulnerable. But if you have, for instance, 20 milligrams per litre free SO2 and you've got a high pH wine, here we go, this is what I was talking about. Let's say the pH is 3.4. After 18 months, the molecular will drop below 0.6 and your wine is in risk zone. Now comes the question, how much do you add? And it does depend a lot on the sterility of the bottling line, because if you've got a really good bottling line and everything's done under sterile conditions and there's no yeast pickup and you're using a membrane, you can theoretically get away with much lower levels than 0.6 molecular, because there isn't anything in the wine. So basically, long way of getting around to the conclusion is that you need to think about DO pickup on your bottling line. You need to think about your level of hygiene in the winery, on the bottling line. You need to think about the closure, how long the wine's going to be in a bottle for, and then make your call based on all those different criteria. Lecture over.
Excellent, thanks, David. So you can't, I mean, we don't really plan on this, we plan on some of our wines not being drunk for 10 years plus. And so once you get into that realm, we're not thinking about having SO2 as such in the wine or it doing much. So, we're just looking to get to a couple of years while it's meant to be young and fresh. And then after that, we're not so worried. Are you bottling with high levels of SO2, Josh, on things that won't be released straight away, or?
Not really, to be honest. I mean, the pHs we're working at in the UK, it's high SO2. Let's talk high molecular SO2. Most of our still wines are, well, I mean, the Kits Coty wines, some of them are below 3. So you really don't want to be putting too much free SO2 in that. Your molecular is going to be through the roof and it's going to taste not very nice. The maximum we top out at is what, 3.25, because everything we do is whole bunch pressed. So again, you don't need very high SO2. The only thing I would say is that we probably use less SO2 on the wines packaged at Greencroft. This is just to back David's point up, than on the wines we package ourselves at Tenterden because of the DO pickup.
Yeah, we know that we'll lose 5 with the bottling process. So it's always 5, and that's what we're always looking for our machine and our particular setup. So I think it also, you mentioned about microbial stability. I think the biggest headache for me, or the thing that you're always worried about, is sterility with bottling, because that is, tartrates are one thing, you can pass that off, but wine with things in it is and exploding bottles and things is something that you can't have. So David, what are your top tips for sterilizing the filling line and making sure that there's nothing in there apart from the wine?
Well, first off, making sure that any residue of wine is flushed out from the previous filling. You need to flush with quite a lot of water. You can actually get, I think 3M produce them. You can get protein tracing swabs that will actually tell you, if there's a residue left behind. Or we use ATPase swabs as well. Just and water checkers, just to sort of check our routine, our procedures to make sure that everything's flushed through. Particularly filters. Filters can hold quite a lot of wine residue. And the second thing is steam. I mean, it really is the only sure way of sanitizing equipment. You know, chemicals, yeah, theoretically they work, but you've got to get the chemicals in contact with the surfaces. And, you know, bottling lines have a lot of intricate parts inside them. The nozzles are quite complex. And trying to get those chemicals into all the nozzles, all the tubes is quite complicated. And that's generally where you end up having problems from.
The steam can sterilize dirt.
Yeah, it doesn't remove the dirt.
No, but it can. You know, you're not going to get anything afterwards. You know, it's whereas the chemicals can't necessarily sterilize the dirt. So yeah, obviously you want to remove it, but and then
and sorry, just on sterility, linked to, you know, having no problems, doing an integrity test on your membrane. It amazes me that some people use membranes and don't do an integrity test. There's no point in using a membrane. You know, it's the last point to check that you actually, you know, your filter is going to stop any microbes getting through.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we integrity test the membrane. It's the newer kind. We haven't had any failures. They're not like the older ones where they would fail as a surprise. And we also find that when we're cleaning the machine afterwards and after steaming, you can do an integrity test following the steaming, following bottling. So we know whether we need to check the wine after bottling. Yeah, I just say with steaming, you know, the regime is a hand width jet of steam from every nozzle and opening for 5 minutes. We normally give it 10 because just, yeah, 5 seems to be the thing.
Sorry, you give it half an hour.
What, from each nozzle?
So we start from the beginning of the line, so it's steaming into the filters.
Yep.
And we'll vent steam from the top of the filter because that's very important, because otherwise the steam can just go through the bottom and you won't sterilize the top. And we'll make sure that steam is running through there for half an hour before we turn it off. You know, it takes a while for the machine to start to warm up, but it'll be half an hour from steam coming out of the dummy bottles underneath the filler heads before we'll decide that that's enough steaming. So it's all in all, it's about a 45-minute process.
Yeah, I think it takes us about half an hour, but we do have a 35 kilowatt steamer. And the other thing is the important thing to clean and steam sterilize is the level correction device as well, because you know, if there's a dodgy nozzle, you'll do every 8 bottles, and if there's the level corrector, you'll do every single bottle with a dollop of yeast. So yeah, we also have used ATP testing on our filling line. We did, luckily, it was a 1,500 bottle run that we had to rebottle 3 times to get it sterile. So we got into the ATP testing, and it turned out that the yeast was coming from under the turntable and basically infecting the air in the filling line over, you know, within, so the first hour you're okay, and then the air would start to fill with yeast. So we then had to fill with the doors open, and that was, yeah, we tested every bit of the line, but yeah, it was the air around the line that was causing the problem. So yeah, tough times, but luckily it was 1,500 bottles. So, and then the other thing which is critical is broken. Oh, actually, Josh, you say that you test every wine after bottling for sterility.
Oh, I mean, not in house. It's just part of the PDO scheme. You know, when you do your post bottling analysis, it'll come back, and if you've got colony forming units, then it's a fail.
Yep. Yeah. So, and then the other thing about broken glass and control of broken glass in the system. I guess, David, you're best to answer this.
Well, yeah, it's, you know, whenever you get an inspection from a supermarket or anyone, that's the first thing that they jump on is broken glass. First point is train your staff. You know, our bottling lines are small compared to some of the big ones. You've got people at the beginning of the line, at the end of the line. Just make sure that they're trained, they know what they're looking for, to keep an eye out for broken bottles. Make sure that they handle the bottles with care. You know, we all know how easy the neck of a champagne bottle will fly off if you actually get it at the wrong place or sabotage. With still wine bottles, the same can happen, in particular screw cap bottles. That neck of the bottle is a particularly important area because that's where the closure is made on a screw cap. And if that is compromised in any way, then your screw cap won't work. Equally well, make sure that the staff at the other end of the line are keeping an eye out for any broken glass or any telltale signs that there's going to be a problem. You need to have a policy if you find a broken bottle on the pallet, which is generally isolating all the bottles around it, clearing up the glass and getting rid of it in a safe glass bin. We would always suggest the bottles are rinsed because that is one way you can actually make sure there's no glass on the inside, a good rinser. And then having a very robust glass breakage procedure if anything breaks on the line. I mean, it's the standard mantra is do not blow it away with air, wash it away with water, not with high power water, but with high volume water, because the moment you start using anything high power, you're just blowing glass all over the place. And then obviously, you know, document what you're doing. All part and parcel of Seltzer, isn't it, Sam?
Well, yeah. If there's a recall, you don't want to have to recall very much. So, yeah, I think glass is the other thing we're really paranoid about. I mean, you know, little tiny bits can end up on people's clothes and things like that. So it really is something that you have to have control of in the winery because the consequences could be really terrible. Emma, is there anything that we need to answer question-wise, or we?
There's one thing we didn't chat about. Sorry, Sam.
Yep.
Would you mind? We've kind of touched upon it in lots of other topics, but we haven't specifically talked about filtrability testing.
Okay, go for it.
Sorry, just something that is so important, and I'm sure David, as a contract bottler, would back me up on this. So many filters do block up for the reason, you know, various reasons. The easy thing to do is just check your filtrability index. It's not a hard thing to do. It's not an expensive kit, really, particularly if you compare it to the price of a few membrane filters that you've had to replace. So yeah, check your filtrability index. There's a standard procedure. And then if you're doing all your bottling yourself, you'll be able to correlate quite well your filtrability index with your own bottling procedure. There is a standard way of doing it, but different bottlers do it in slightly different ways because they've kind of tailored it to their own way. So I would always do it ourselves to know what our number is. Then if we're having it, and that, you know, that's really important if we're bottling it ourselves, but also I'd send pre-shipment samples off to the bottler as well. So if I was sending it to David, I'd send it to him and I'd say, you check it because I want you to be happy that it's going to go down your line without causing any issues. And if you are checking your filtrability index, yeah, the one thing really you've got to pay attention to is the temperature of the wine that you do the test at, because that makes a massive difference. And also that leads on, just a side note, temperature of the wine when you fill it, and make sure it's as close to 20 degrees as possible, because that will increase if not, if you're much lower, then it will increase the fouling on the filter. Sorry, just wanted to get that in. Thank you.
I think that, yeah.
Totally agree. I mean, that's why we stipulate that people have to send us samples. And we actually do the filtrability tests with the same media that we actually use on the line, because they can vary.
Yeah, the temperature of screw caps have got a much lower temperature range tolerance, I think, than cork. So we bottle for 20 for that reason as well. So.
There was a question about CMC and filtrability. I don't know, do you want to talk about that now?
Touch on it.
Well, you've got very short space of time. I think, again, just you've got to test, and don't assume that it will work.
The CMC can be filtered out either in your, you know, if you add it before your membrane, or if you're thinking of adding it before your final filtration, it can filter out, and you can't really test how much is in there. And you can't add any more than the legal maximum, even if you think it's been filtered out. So it really is something that I think you have to understand for your own wine.
There's been a question about the use of the potassium polyaspartate instead as well. It's another product that you can add to the wine to stabilize it. But again, it's not that been around that long, so how long it will last, whether it filters out. I mean, there's still a lot of trials and work that needs to be done on it. Again, it can be a useful tool, but
the difference with polyaspartate compared to CMC is that it doesn't react with tannins, so it can be used for rosé and red wine.
Yeah, so if you find yourself unable to use CMC when you thought you would be, you would be able to. You can now use you could use potassium polyaspartate instead in your rosés this year, but again, with the caveat that you do some trials and some tests and don't just assume.
So
sorry, there was one other question. I don't think it got answered about using. Christina's asking about shipping wine to, for example, to your premises, David. Do you prefer it in Arlington bag in box or IBCs?
Arlington's IBCs are horrendous. I mean, we have had product delivered to us in IBCs, and I've never seen a DO level less than 1.5 milligrams per litre. You've got that ullage space at the top that's impossible to fill properly. And we've seen DO levels of 6-7 milligrams per litre. With Arlington's, because they are empty when the bags are sort of collapsed when you fill them up, there's no headspace. The DO level is much, much lower. We get beer into our fixed line as well, and we've had DO levels of less than 0.1 milligram per litre shipped in Arlington's. And the other thing about IBCs is that they're horrendous to try and clean too. You always get a bit of wine sitting at the bottom that won't come out. So there are we should say there are other alternatives to Arlington's available.
And there is another question, Sam, I don't know, that's just come in about bottling unfiltered wine. I was going to type an answer to that, saying that that's a question for another session entirely. Do you know?
I've only done it when my filter broke.
Yeah. At your peril, I'd say. But that's not a question for this session, I don't think.
Yeah, you pretty much ignore everything we've said if you're going to bottle unfiltered wine.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, someone did ask about the ATP test. Basically, it's a swab and it finds traces of life. So it's the same thing that use the same science as why glowworms glow. So you put it when you swab the ATP swab and put it in the device, it checks how much it's glowing because there's the same materials in the glowworms. So it tells you whether there's any life in what you swabbed or in the air or the water that you've tested.
You can check how well you clean your hands too. That's frightening.
So less than 5, I think, is operating theatre. Less than 50 is food prep, and then the other one is 500 is normal clean or something.
Yeah.
There's another question from Philip. So off topic, can we have a session on barrel use? But yeah, and I was going to say that my final point was going to be if anyone's got any suggestions that they would like us to cover in these webinars, then please let WineGB know through the usual route or email me directly. But WineGB will pass everything on to me, and the winemaking committee. Are we all done?
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone wants a glass of wine.
Let's go and drink a nice freshly filtered glass of wine. So I'll be welcoming David to Hattingley next week to bottle our still wines. So hopefully we've done everything that's been suggested in this to get ready for it. But yeah, thank you guys, all three of you, for your expertise and your time, and for giving us all this valuable information. It's a big topic to cover in an hour, but I think we covered quite some ground. We're looking forward to the preparation for tirage or bottling sparkling wine on the 15th of April. So we'll see you then, if not before. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye.